We are living in a time when fewer and fewer people go to any church, and yet the few churches that appear to be growing and expanding are the ones that are huge, and some of that is because of the technological possibility of having jumbotrons and being able to use audio-visual effects to grow churches into the size of football stadiums. But our culture is also growing into a period of time in which we choose greater and greater anonymity. While the NSA is demanding that Apple allow them to access absolutely everything about us, which I guess is not that different from the fact that Apple already accesses everything about us, that we may have hundreds and hundreds of friends on social media, on your Twitter, your Snapchat, your Facebook accounts. But if a movie comes out that you want to go and see, you might not even be able to think of someone that you can go to a movie with. I know that happens to me. I grew up in a time, most of you did as well, when neighbors would simply see each other in the backyard and they would just spontaneously put together a barbecue, just fire up the grill and everybody stand around and cook out and eat in the backyards and talk. That kids grew up knowing that they could just reliably run out the back door when they got home from school, and there would be a pickup game of basketball or baseball or football, and we didn't even mind using the backyards of people that didn't have kids to extend our field, and they didn't mind because we all knew each other. There was a kind of a sense of community before there were privacy fences and the kind of concerns about keeping ourselves separate from everyone else. The front porch on houses where people sat until the house was cool enough to sleep in became the backyard family room once air conditioning was invented. Even sociologists have commented at length about the fact that more and more people go bowling, fewer and fewer people join bowling leagues. We don't want to commit ourselves to anything. We want to be able to just spontaneously act and socialize without any planning. And so far as the decline in church attendance goes, we have to admit that we're really part of the problem. We are a very small church, but we provide religious content for more than 10,000 people a month through our YouTube and iTunes channels. And there are people who watch our sermons every week who live less than 2 blocks from this building. But they don't want to get up on Sunday morning and come here. They would rather sit and look at their computer at 6 o'clock this evening in their pajamas with a bowl of Cheerios in their hand. That there's a disconnect that is happening as people are curious and they're interested. And I think the great liability of liberals is that we think once we've derived informed opinions that we have done what we're supposed to do, that we don't have to actually connect to another human being. Now, given that we are now so small, you wonder why? Why keep it open? Why keep the church going? Is there not room for us in other churches in the community? That we've got huge Baptist, Methodist, Episcopal, Lutheran congregations that are half empty. It's not like there's not a seat for us in other communities. There are, of course, thousands of seats available. The problem is that you don't get to a church like this until you have discovered that you don't fit in those other places, that this is truly an alternative church, both by our unwillingness to assassinate our brains and their willingness to refuse to accept us because we're female or gay or divorced, or in some cases because we read books or asked questions. Virtually all of us have become a part of the Church Alumni Association. Some of us thought our way out of traditional religion meant that we were forever going to be on our own. We open our minds now to the wisdom found in other faith traditions, but also from science books and from literature, from plays. We feel entirely free to reject the doctrines and creeds that once chained virtually all of Western humanity into the darkness of irrational superstition, prejudice, and falsehood. But folks, I'm desperate that we not just become self-congratulatory, cynical philosophers who have rejected the myths and neurotic fear and guilt of the Dark Ages. Hopefully, our liberation also empowers us to put our hands and our feet and our heart into a shared faith that actually responds to reality, because there are a lot of dark corners to reality. That's why we try to continue to serve the poor and bring a prophetic witness to social justice whenever we have the chance, both by feeding the hungry and by making visible opposition to the institutions that create poverty, oppression, and violence. We're trying to claim a living faith and not a dead philosophy or an irrelevant philosophy. I mean, if you had to go around wearing a tag, I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic, I'm a humanist, I'm a panentheist, whatever, who cares what those labels are if you are not actively engaged in trying to bring light into the dark places of the world? The old mainstream denominational churches are trying to figure out how to survive in the face of declining numbers and increasing irrelevance, and we keep trying to figure out how we can be more engaged, where I think the decline in numbers in the denominations has made them really turn inward and not engage in society and try to avoid any engagement of society. I think we're at the opposite end of that spectrum. Whether we simply cease to exist or not, we want to stay engaged in what matters and where society really is broken. It may have been fittingly symbolic that our first few Sundays we met not in a country club, but rather in a funeral home parlor, because we had a body that needed to be buried. We needed to bury the church that we had left and that had left us behind. We had to eulogize a faith that was full of lies and magic and superstition, dead ritual, church doctrines, denominational creeds and rules, many of which sounded so fanciful that they would be better as an incantation in a Harry Potter movie than something with an actual, an educated person would say out loud in the 21st century. Still, we recognize that the path that we have followed is not original to us. There have been thinkers, philosophers, prophets through the millennia that were willing to look through the facade of superstition to realize there was something more. I love this text that Barry read for us from the prophet Isaiah. And, most churches follow the common lectionary and they read certain passages of Scripture every Sunday, and it rolls around every 3 years. This passage that Barry read about the priests and the prophets being drunk and stumbling, that's not in the lectionary. That text is never read in traditional churches. So I like to bring it up here every 2 or 3 years because it is such a classic piece that bears testimony that 3,000 years ago, there's this poet, prophet, who was aware of exactly what pushed us into the Church Alumni Association so long ago. On the one hand, he does make the temple sound a little bit like an episode out of Tosh.0. The priests are drunk, they're stumbling, they're falling all over themselves, and he says quite graphically that there's vomit everywhere. I hope that's not a literal description of the temple, but we know exactly what he means. That what they had to say had the value of just vomiting. And I would challenge you, just turn on religious programming on television or download a typical service on the internet. And I'm sorry that I'm being so insulting or condescending about this, but truly, if you keep looking at the TV and saying, so what? So what? So what does it mean? What is the implication? It has the value of vomit. The other image is a little bit less obvious in translation. The powerful priesthood who presided over the huge temple, the pinnacle of institutional religion in Israel, the prophet says that they are as sophisticated as a baby that has just begun to be weaned from the breast. And he repeats phrases that their religion is to them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. The here a little, there a little is like calling out students in a classroom. Here, little one, you little one, stand up and recite the creeds of your faith. In Hebrew, though, what he's saying, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, nor even close. I mean, I had Hebrew scholars as professors, and so you could take everything I know about Hebrew and put it in a thimble and shake it around. One of my professors said that this particular text was rooted in onomatopoeia, that the way that it sounds in Hebrew is supposed to sound like a baby prattling or a drunk mumbling, kavla, kav, savla, sav, siershum, siershum. They're just babies. They're just drunks. And either way, the prophet asked the question, who then can you teach? If you're drunk, if you're just a baby, what do you really have to say to the world? Because all you know is kavla, kav, savla, sav, siershum, siershum. You know, even driving down I-44, you see the signs, Jesus paid it all. Jesus' blood. What are they talking about? Have any of you committed a crime so egregious that someone needs to be killed for it, let alone God needs to be killed for it? I mean, I've done some things that are wrong, but I think a $15 fine would cover it, really. I just can't imagine that so many people will just keep repeating these lines as if they were supposed to mean something in the 21st century. The churches of our birth were not much concerned with liberation from oppression. Our churches were not really concerned with fighting poverty or racism. Though there were heroic and wonderful exceptions, most of the churches of our experience stood back and watched the civil rights movement. Even the predominantly black churches. I mean, Martin Luther King's first preaching job was in a church that had just fired their pastor for being too involved in politics. And to get the job, Martin Luther King promised that he wouldn't do that. Now, as it turns out, the bus strike kind of changed things for Martin Luther King. But even the black church in the South oftentimes sat out the civil rights movement. They were silent about the war in Vietnam. Now, there were the Berrigan brothers out there somewhere. Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day were getting arrested and beaten and interviewed by Time magazine. But most of us went to church on Sunday mornings and were ushered into the sanctuary where we said a pledge of allegiance to the flag, and then they asked us to pledge our money. And then they told you in sermons about what they'd read in the funny pages and made allusions to their favorite sports teams. All the while expecting that you should worry, really worry about your soul that you've never seen, to be afraid of a hell that you've never seen, to live in order to gain entry into heaven that you've never seen, and to somehow just force yourself to believe that you are so horrible that God had to kill his own son to make up for your sins. Kavla, kav, savla, sav, siershum, siershum. When I was a college student, I can remember our campus minister condemning the British philosopher Bertrand Russell. And in the middle of the 20th century, he was begging, I think politely, although he was treated like he was just an absolute scalawag by the religious community, but he was entreating people to start thinking critically. He said, I wish to propose for your favorable consideration a doctrine which may, I fear, appear wildly paradoxical and subversive. The doctrine in question is this, that it is undesirable to believe something when there's no ground whatever for presuming that it is true. I must admit that if such an opinion became common, it would completely transform our social and political life. And like a lot of you, I'm just locked into watching primary and poll results, and you hear stuff like free education. You just don't have a right to reach your hand into my pocket and take money for your kid to go to college, this kind of, and it's like, do you realize if we had not invaded Iraq that we could pay all college tuition for the next 40 years? That what's wrong with free education compared to a free war? Because all of these things cost. But the ability to apply critical thinking, and unfortunately, what passes for journalism, the talking heads on the TV screens, it is stunning that they will parrot this kind of stuff as if they are absolutely disembodied from any kind of reality. That the amount of money that we spend subsidizing the profits of oil companies would pay for at least community college associate's degrees for everyone in the United States. But somehow the tax breaks and perks for billionaires are sacred, and we act like they don't cost us anything. But the cost of ignorance is a price that we're willing to pay to avoid educating our own kids. This is what frightened traditional religion, the suggestion that people should just stop believing things because they have been told them, that you should have to think your way through these things, to test, to interrogate. Because from the time of Constantine, religious people have been asked to simply repeat rituals, to kneel, to genuflect, to speak in tongues, to weep and shout, and then empty their wallets because everyone around them was doing it, and your parents did it, and your grandparents did it, and you would be disappointing to them if you didn't do it. How many people have we seen come here that couldn't tell their families that they were coming here because their Catholic parents or grandparents would be so disappointed in them? Now, I'm not saying that all these traditional religions are all bad. There were people who were helped. There were families that stayed together. There were people who reformed from criminal or addictive behavior. There were people who found the ability through traditional religions to control their more base impulses. But what about when they discovered that the snake oil they'd been buying was all just fake? It's like, I think of denominational religion much the way that I think when used to see those head-on commercials, you just apply directly to the forehead. And there's no active ingredient in it at all, but they constantly advertised it to the point that people began to believe that if they just rubbed a little petroleum jelly on their forehead, that their headaches would go away. And when the sales started to drop, then they changed it where you could just rub it on anything. And I'm so glad that none of you bought that product. If I saw you sitting around rubbing that stuff on, it's just amazing that people will believe something simply because it's repeated over and over and over. But how much of your time, your emotional energy, your resources have been poured into trying to force yourself to believe in superstition, trying to make yourself believe that repeating magical phrases and participating in magical rituals would somehow make God act differently, or would change the course of someone's health, or that would get angels and demons to do your bidding. We wasted our time, our energy, our money, while our government sent our young men and women to die in wars, telling us they were fighting to defend our freedom, when our freedom was not at stake from anything except them. That they were fighting for profit, for cheap oil. And they try to use Jesus to back that up. We bow our heads, close our eyes, while corporations treated workers like they were lumps of coal to be thrown into the furnace for profit. And banks use the people's money to make themselves rich while keeping the people groveling for a chance to ever own a home, or even to be able to buy a car to get them to work to pay for their car. The fact that this state maintains a payday loan industry that is willing to charge the poorest of the poor, sometimes nearly 2,000% interest, so that the already rich become rich. And one of the families that owns the most payday loan businesses in town were recently interviewed on our NPR station as examples of philanthropy. I nearly drove into the ditch listening to this interview, that this family that has stolen, literally extorted millions of dollars from the poorest people in this city, give back a few $1,000s and then want to be adored as philanthropists. They're thugs, they're criminals, they're bullies, they're thieves. but they sit in a very prominent church under a very tall steeple, and they want to be applauded by the public. This is wrong. Moses was a liberator of slaves. If you believe any part of the Moses narrative, he led a massive slave revolt. Jesus, Muhammad, Zoroaster, Gandhi, Romero, Martin Luther King, they were all liberators. They reached out to the poor, the orphan, the sick, the oppressed. The church, however, has mostly just asked women to shut up and be obedient. The church has made gay people feel so guilty they wanted to kill themselves, and they've treated blacks and immigrants like they were objects of perpetual charity for which we could tip now and then to make ourselves feel better about ourselves, to give them a holiday basket at Thanksgiving and our worn-out clothes and shoes that we wouldn't be caught dead in public, but never to be treated as if they were equals. Kavla kav, kavla kav, savla sav, savla sav. I am so sick of that stuff. I am so done with that. In the 21st century, in possession of endless information at our fingertips, science, rational thought, critical thinking, anyone still sitting in one of those big churches trying to learn how to speak in tongues, or waiting for their turn to light a candle in front of a statue, or trying to make themselves believe that their particular holy book was actually written by the finger of God and everybody else's is just fake, they're like a bird sitting in a bird cage when the door is open. And it's one thing to sit in the cage when you're not given any options, but when the door has been open for years, when the information is available to you with this tremendous superhighway of knowledge, to still sit in the cage, I don't get it. Isn't it time to sober up? Isn't it time to grow up, to set aside the superstitions of the Dark Ages and to embrace the kind of faith that did make the Berrigan brothers break into the draft office and burn the records, that called Martin Luther King to face down attack dogs and fire hoses to march in the streets, that made Dorothy Day willing not only to feed the poor and live in a house with them, but to walk into the public and shake her fist at the government and businesses that kept making them poor. 3,000 years ago, Isaiah was willing to say, truly with stammering lip and an alien tongue, stuttering, terrified to speak, you stand up and say, that's all vomit. This is rest. To give rest to the weary, to give a break to the people that have been doing all of the labor. This is repose. But the prophet says, but they would not hear it. This sermon would get me fired in 99 out of 100 churches anywhere in America today. And we think sometimes when we live in the Ozarks that this is just such a backwaters place. I would remind you that 40% of Republican voters across the United States have already decided they're going to vote for Donald Trump. And I feel like the whole Trump campaign coming a year after having a Confederate flag is no longer politically correct. You can now put a Trump sign on your car to let people know that even though you can't fly a Confederate flag, you're still a bigot and an idiot. That you can just make an announcement that I'm not giving up on racism, I'm not giving up on prejudice, I'm not giving up on abusing the poor, to tell the bandits on Wall Street and the powerful on Capitol Hill that you're still willing to be their mental slave. I think we need to tell the priests, the pastors, the ministers, and the evangelists that they can keep their promises of pie in the sky when we die in the by and by, until they meet us and help us try to get actual treatment for the addicted, housing for veterans, the physically and mentally sick, the victims of capitalism run mad that they have practiced ignoring. I'll give them my undivided attention to let them tell me about their view of the Trinity and heaven and hell and substitutionary death and sacraments and intercessory prayer when they tell me what they're doing to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, to guarantee access to health care for the sick and jobs for the unemployed and homes for the homeless, and how their religion is in any way going to help stop the wars in Syria and Mexico and keep our flying robots out of the skies over Afghanistan and Pakistan. Until then, end, their religion to me is nothing but line upon line upon line, here a little, there a little, and frankly, I've got better things to do with my time.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.